Sure. Thank you so much, Victor. Definitely has been an experience, let's say, as the first Black executive director within an ecosystem that has been known and been called like a big boys club, a big or old boys club, even. So definitely stepping into this position, I had to first ask myself, am I ready to be the first Black and woman leading in this space? And, eventually I got to the answer yes, because I figured if I had not used the experience that I had gained over the past few years within this ecosystem, then who else might be seen qualified to step up and take this position? And so I felt that I would, if I had not stepped into this position, I would be discounting the community, but also myself, and the hard work that I've been able to put through, and the experience that I've been able to gain over this time. And so I think that it definitely intergenerational collaboration is something that has been embedded within my system for a long time. And I think that it's very essential for us to ensure that not only are we, or am I as a new leader stepping in with this brand new vibe and information, but also looking at the foundation that our ancestors and the people before me had already created, because it's really not about reinventing the wheel, or trying to do backflips to impress, but making sure that we're seeing what has already been created, and also being to build upon it with this new information that we've been able to gain. And so interacting with all of the many different folks from around the world for the NAB. So NAB actually stands for National Advisory Board. Basically, an organization called the Global Steering Group has given a mandate to TIP and CAFID to create a National Advisory Board for impact investing across Canada. Now, there are NABs across the world in many different countries, like some of the ones that Victor named, like Spain, Colombia, Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Colombia, Spain. And so basically we've all been given like an outline and a framework to be able to build this national advisory board for our country. And so, it's been great to be able to start to look at what exactly Canadians need from a national advisory board for impact investing, but also looking at, again, the folks that have been running a national advisory board, and being able to gain a lot of the insight that has been able to help us run forward with the many things that we have possible to do within the impact investing space. And so for myself, again, within this journey, stepping into a space that's known as an old boy space, it's time for us to evaluate and become more progressive about putting people first. Because for centuries, we've allowed money to decide what happens to people, right? It determines where people get to live, what types of jobs they have, who they have access to. Funny enough, we let money determine how much more money you're allowed to get, which is an interesting concept, because a lot of the times, especially from an entrepreneurial perspective, like the reason why folks are applying for funding or searching for capital is because they do not already have it, right? And so it's like the entrepreneurs end up sort of in this funding cycle. Okay, you know what? We don't have capital. We need capital. And now this organization, is seeing that they have capital, which is kind of irrelevant to the work we do, but we're going to find some way to create a project or a workshop or something, that qualifies us to get this funding. And then, again, it becomes that cycle that's sort of irrelevant to their business. And so again, it's time for us to start thinking about how capital and funding has an effects on people's well-being on a community level. And again, becoming more cognizant or open to allowing the spaces and tables that we convene at to look like what Canadians look like. I remember growing up in school, we were always taught that Canada was a melting pot with a whole bunch of different cultures that are able to come together and identify as Canadians. But when we look at the way the ecosystem has been set up, those systems and groups do not look like what Canadians are actually known to look like. So in my new role, I'm really excited to, again, have members feel open and welcome to join the space from wherever they stand. And again, prioritizing people and communities that represent Canadians. And also focusing on diversity in many different ways. I think that, of course, it's important to look at diversity in terms of race and ensuring that our communities and memberships look like Canadians. However, also looking at diversity, inclusion, and equity through the many other types of lenses like gender and disability and age, and even types of business and people interacting with impact investing, because it's not only investors and funders that are interacting with impact investing, it's also investees. It's also the small businesses that are going to be receiving and utilizing those that funding to create deeper impact. So I think that it's definitely a time for us to also include, again, investees as a part of the conversation, because oftentimes, funders and those that are providing capital, are creating programs for SMEs, small businesses to be able to gain impact. However, they end up missing the mark because they've decided to leave the communities separate from the design that they're creating. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely room for growth, but I'm proud and I feel privileged to be in a space of leadership where that I can take my lens and experience and create change also.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those insights, my sister. And it's funny enough, my brother, Eldon Holder Jr. was just talking about the concept of the accredited versus non-accredited investors in a conversation just a few days ago. So there is still some discrepancies. Some of the thoughts that we've gathered today has just made me think of a quote that speaks specifically around power attracting the worst and power corrupting the best. And when I think about that quote of power attracting the worst folks and corrupting the best, I think about what Smitha mentioned when she stated that the biggest check has the loudest voice, or what Jeff mentioned when he said that capital can't lead to the solutions, it must be community that leads to solutions. So with all that in mind, Adam, based off of your experience at Mars and being in the ecosystem for 10, 15 years, what are some of the obvious changes that you're seeing in the ecosystem? And more importantly, the way you conceptualize place-based. I know your SVX is doing some work in Colombia and in emerging markets. What does place-based impact investing look like to you right now in 2022?
No, great question. So yeah, maybe I'll start with the place-based side of things. So when we think about place-based impact investing or community finance, we think that as impact investing or social finance approaches, which aim to solve social and environmental challenges, tackle anything from climate action to equity, housing, and otherwise in a particular region or neighborhood or community. So something that usually you can walk to or otherwise see or touch in your own backyard. And I think there's a lot of history and background to that, including in Canada. We have place-based movements that date back to the solidarity and credit union movement in Quebec, of which they were kind of neighbors and neighborhoods and regions that sought to bring and acquire capital to then invest back in the houses and the businesses that were close to them, or Van City, which started with, I think it was maybe $50 or $100, then now it was financing local enterprises and businesses in that particular region. Now is over $20 billion in assets, but still is dedicated to how do you finance these local organizations and enterprises in order to drive more positive outcomes for local communities. And even if you look, and sorry if I go too much into history, but the CDFI movement in the US, or Community Development Financial Institution movement, which came out of social movements in the 60s and 70s, including civil rights and anti-poverty agendas, which is about how do you bring capital and ownership and leadership into ensuring you can get financing into those areas that lacked it, but had significant assets and opportunity and potential, but otherwise were kind of excluded from the mainstream systems. And so I think when we look at today, In Canada, the community finance or place-based impact investing movement has significantly grown and evolved. There are now many funds or intermediaries that are active in community, from Thrive on Vancouver Island to St. John Community Loan Fund, what's happening on Fogo Island, and places in between like Verge Capital, even the Jubilee Fund in Manitoba, Edmonton, Social Enterprise Fund, and that's just some examples. But I think what's really interesting and where we have an opportunity and a real need to be able to evolve is how are we intersecting not just place-based, where it's managing and navigating in community, but making sure that there is leadership and opportunity to be able to not only identify what's happening from Black Canadian communities, Indigenous communities, rural communities, which are untold stories of success and opportunity. Some of the stories that Victor, for example, has told in the past about the Susu kind of bankers movement. There are places like Access Community Capital Fund or other entities that thrive in neighborhoods that are driven by community, but not by, call it, the mainstream powers that be. So I think that's an important opportunity that we're driving, and we think about, not to plug, but our work with catalysts. When we're looking at the last conversation we had is how are we providing kind of an action and a platform to embed, for example, Black Canadians leadership to showcase what's happening there, and find a way where we can kind of support collectively and be allies for that particular agenda. And so that again cuts across each of those segments or areas that I think are important when we think about place-based or local investing, which again cuts across Canada as well writ large, where there's other opportunities for kind of lessons to learn as well as work being done. And this interfaces a bit with what Jaleesa talked about on the National Advisory Board front, but there's also places where we can learn outside of Canada. Again, there's lots of really interesting things happening from coast to coast, things happening in the US and UK. But places like Colombia, where we do a bit of work, we've done some work in the Americas, has done some groundbreaking activities and offer a real great peer example of how you can imagine impact investing or social finance or solidarity finance, however you describe it, in a different way. So they've built out, they've been on a journey for similarly 5 or 10 years in that particular country. We've been fortunate to work alongside them to create a national advisory board for impact investing, to bring in kind of the convening power and leadership of the government of Canada through Global Affairs, which is a huge advocate and ally for this kind of work, which is advancing community finance or place-based investing, is focusing on rural regions, on women, on Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, and finding opportunities to be able to build capacity for those kinds of enterprises, for those kinds of capital providers, and then put the systems infrastructure in place, including the policy that's necessary to be able to drive this, alongside bringing the foundation and institutional actors to buy into this agenda. It takes time and patience, and local leadership. I think fundamental to all of this is it's not Global Affairs Canada or organizations like ours that are providing an expert path, but it's how do you animate and catalyze and realize the community asset potential that already exists, which is resident in the communities that we all work with and for and alongside. So I think we look at where we're going in Canada on community finance generally, is we can build infrastructure. So there's kind of back office boring stuff that we'll work on. I think that's super important. I think that's a piece of what we'll do on the Catalyst agenda, build toolkits for those that are starting or those that are growing. Also kind of bring together and build the connective capacity of those organizations on the ground as well, and help to tell stories. Like there's just so many untold stories of outstanding kind of community finance or place-based investing here and elsewhere that we can learn from and learn alongside. So I'll maybe stop there because I don't want to keep wandering along, but just appreciate the question.
No. We appreciate you, and we appreciate all those actionable insights, and especially you bringing up the concept of the CDFI, the Community Development Financial Institution. A lot of folks don't recognize that when that came out of the civil rights movement and created policy reform to create the Community Investment Act, that was based off of study groups. That was based off of folks actually leaning in on the boring stuff. Because the fact remains that we have 40 plus people here this dawning learning and building their capacity, and they're going to share with their communities. And when we talk about CDFIs, we recognize economic power. The model in Quebec and the Francophone communities that have been resilient and determined and have created an international model around the social economy. Nancy Niumpton, Beatrice Allen, Philip Garand, that's remarkable work. The rural communities, Diana Jetting and the 267 community futures, rural communities saying we're economic actors. That's remarkable work. The over 60 Aboriginal financial institutions, AFIs, the work that Raven Capital, others doing remarkable work. We have one Black CDFI in the country, FACE, which I represent in every space I'm at. Tiffany's not here today, but the Federation for African Canadian Economics plays a remarkable role and is sitting on 17,000 applications, deployed $23 million of capital in a year. That is a feat that no financial institution in the history of Canada has ever had to pull off. So I'm saying all this to say that when we talk about local and when we talk about impact investing, when we talk about inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, no one's free if everyone's free, no one's free. So we have to find ways and means to create better economic outcomes for all of us. So I'm going to move our question on. Actually, before I do that, I want to make sure I plug, you mentioned Thrive, Fogo, and Verge. For folks that aren't familiar with those terms, Thrive is the two Christies out in British Columbia, Scale Collaborative, doing some remarkable work. Verge Capital used to be James Chan, now it's our colleague Phil San. And Fogo researched the work of Zita Cobb, Zitacobb. Zita Cobb is one of the most remarkable colleagues Setsi has. We actually have her speaking in a few months at a convening similar to this. She was recently on 60 Minutes, Zita Cobb. So I want to make sure that for folks that aren't plugged into the ecosystem, that these acronyms and terminology, it's all about knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation. So we're going to move on to Robin. Robin, at ESDC, through the IRP, Investment Readiness Program, and other initiatives, you and your colleagues have engaged many communities on the margins of many ecosystems. How has that journey been for your team?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. That's a good question. And as I said, I think the word journey is well suited to this kind of work, the work that we do. When I hear the presentations from other panelists, and as I've been hearing over the last several days in this amazing convening that you have created, the overwhelming thing that I think about is the fact that I don't actually do anything. You guys are the people that actually do stuff. So, it sort of feels like all I get to do is do my very best to make sure that that kind of activity that you're describing in such a rich context is made possible by the policy levers that I have the privilege to work with. So working for government, I feel, is a little bit like being, one part of a ginormous elephant, only I'm not inclined to use the word elephant because elephants are actually quite agile. I don't think of government as being terribly agile. And elephants are very good at developing familiar relationships for the long term. I'm not sure the government is actually that good at that either. But those values I certainly hold true for myself. So I work in this environment, but feel as if I'm trying to push as an individual. So I speak today more as an individual than as a government representative. So I was thinking about, if not elephant, then maybe sloth. I don't know. I'm open to suggestions on this one, but indeed, that's where we come from. And in thinking about, and I should add that I mean no disrespect to my employer or my colleagues for that matter. I wouldn't describe them individually in any of those ways. But my privilege is to work through the policy of a funding instrument. So what I can help to design is how that money gets spent in communities. So obviously this is taxpayers' money, so I have that accountability and responsibility. But if I think about it in terms of its opportunity and its limitations, the money I think about, as I say, it doesn't actually do, it is the people, it is where it lands that's what money doesn't do, people do. So how can we make money do the best possible thing it can? And I talked about passion before. I do get really passionate about how I can do something to make sure this money does better. That journey is about being as open as possible, about learning as much as possible, about being transparent so that we can better understand where does the money land, what is the destination, and who's going to benefit and how are they going to benefit. So it's about starting with money and then imagining how the people turn that into something of value. And Victor, at a session a couple of days ago or yesterday, I can't, maybe it was the other day, Thursday, you mentioned Mark Carney, and I've been working my way through his book, Values. It's a work in progress. That's a large book and it's very dense, but it's absolutely blowing my mind and fascinating about how we create value, and with all the very negative attributes and the opportunity to have positive attributes like we're hearing from the panelists here today. So it's a journey of discovery, and I thought of like it's sort of leaning into reaching out to mix a whole bunch of metaphors together. But if we don't do that from, where I sit, if I don't think about leaning into reaching out, then it means that the money only lands in a small version of reality rather than a much broader ecosystem. We designed the IRP with principles, we might talk about principles later, with principles about sort of inclusion and diversity, and sort of the tagline of the intention of the IRP is to build the opportunity for absolutely every type of social purpose organization everywhere in Canada who are serving any issue, who are led by any group, individual, doesn't matter. No matter what they are doing, if they are delivering social purpose to communities, to individuals, they should have the opportunity to understand what repayable capital, what financing can do for them. And they may explore that opportunity and decide that it doesn't work for them. That's fine. It's just that if they can't even have the opportunity to get their heads around what capital can do versus funding, and I'm using those words very explicitly in that different context, then we can't see how money can actually be used in those much more vast ways. So you talk about communities on the margin, and I know that it's not an accurate term, but it feels like it's very reflective of a very shallow perspective of a very limited ecosystem. I mean, hear the voices that we're hearing today. These are not marginal voices. These are voices where communities are thriving because of the work that they're doing. And I want the ecosystem that we're contributing to look like that. It has to look like it's just that expansive. So bringing those voices, but more importantly, making sure that the value is included in any vision that we collectively have of this ecosystem. So directing those funds in a way to convert into that type of value is where I see the journey and where I see my intention around building an ecosystem that is robust and not weakened by its own limitation of itself. So the worst we could possibly do is perpetuate any injustices that have made us use the word margins. And no thriving ecosystem, as far as I'm concerned, can afford to be without the resources, the values, and the voices of everybody who is richly expressing themselves here. That's the journey for me.
Thank you so much, Robin, for all those wise words, actionable insights, and your leadership. And I love that sentiment of money doesn't do, people do. And it reminds me of something that one of our colleagues yesterday, Atif Baskiari, the CEO of North Pine Foundation, he was on a panel at our in-person session yesterday in Toronto, and he spoke about money as medicine, very similar to our colleague Edgar from the Decolonizing Wealth Institute that I put in the chats. And when you brought up the book Values, I was thinking about the work Mark Carney is doing, and also think about Dr. Jessica Gore-Numhard and her book Collective Courage, and Dr. Carolyn Shanez Hussein and her work on microfinance and the Black social economy. And three of the My favorite moments in this ecosystem this year has been the first one being Jaleesa being named as the ED of TIP. That was like a remarkable moment for our community in many ways. Second was when I met my colleague Laurel from Rally Assets. Setsi's been involved in the social finance fund and process of the fall economic statement of 2018. And we've been navigating wholesalers, and I met Laurel and a breath of fresh air. And then the third moment was when my brother Brian Duwartz asked me for an endorsement letter for a venture fund that's coming out right now. And so, Brian, the work you're doing is remarkable. And I think it's important to really reflect on that work. But more importantly, I'm bringing it up right now because my wife always gets mad at me when I watch Democracy Now! Late at night, because it always kind of gets me flustered. And maybe a few nights ago, I found out an Ontario pension fund lost $90 million in crypto. $90 million. And these are conversations that me and Zita Cobb had, and these are conversations that Setsi's having around our podcast, People, Power, and Pensions, because we're firm believers that pension funds are the stewards of the wealth of the 99%. So when I heard an Ontario pension fund lost $90 million in crypto, it bothered my spirit because I know the work that Black Tech Capital and others are doing, and the capital that you're deploying to folks in the Bay Area around clean tech. So Brian, I'd love for you to share with us some of the emerging trends you're seeing in the ecosystem, and more importantly, anything that's exciting that you're working on right now.
Thanks, Victor. And that's, I guess that's a pretty big question. In terms of exciting work, I mean, first I'll start off by saying I'm an advisor in a number of different startups, accelerators across Canada, across the world, involved in foundations like Techstars, Founder Institute, Foresight, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, which we're now starting to build out, excuse me, a sustainability program within there for Black entrepreneurs. And what I'm seeing time and time again is Black entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs, those are the two groups I see missing at the table in a lot of these spaces, right? They're not there. And yet when I go looking inside of my networks, my organizations, I find lots of Black entrepreneurs focused on, and all the great stuff they're building. There's a company out in Cambridge, Ontario, where he's developed some remarkable nano processing technologies. He's got the capability to process plastics the way no one else in the world is able to do, be able to absorb oil spills, to be able to be separators for battery technology. And he developed this, his first thing was during COVID, developing a new filter for mass, which was 6 times more breathable, but yet passed an N95 rating than what else is out there. You've got great technologies I see in the carbon capture space, where they're taking carbon, capturing CO2 at source, combine it with ethanol, and using that to make useful products, turning into things like carbon fibers, which we know are going to be used more and more. I have it in my bike, it's going into cars, it's going into so many different spaces, and all the way to capturing carbon that's now into a useful product. So it's not just trying to bury it into the oceans, which has long-term implications, or trying to bury it underground. So these are examples of Black entrepreneurs that I see doing great things. And I'm looking at Black entrepreneurs from coast to coast in Canada, looking across North America. And yet, as I said, they are not in the traditional spaces you would think you would find them. And then so many of them that I talk to saying, this is so refreshing to talk to you. This is so different to talk to someone like myself, as an entrepreneur, been through a lot of what they've had, and bringing them in and connected to communities. And yet their biggest challenge still is getting capital. Some of these are at the early stages. When Robin just mentioned, capital can unlock things. Yes, it's great if you can get loan financing, but some of them need, that direct investment capital now to bring them to that next stage. Some have revenue, some don't have revenue, because of in the clean tech space. And as Jeff mentioned, clean tech and health tech go together hand in hand, which is another area that we look at as a secondary as well. You need that capital to bring in additional people onto your team to take that to the next level. But as I said, the technologies that I'm seeing out there, and as an engineer, You know, I'm very familiar with a lot of these things, been working in this space a long time. There's some really remarkable stuff that I see being developed in the Black community. And as a world, as a planet, if we forget about these other groups, if we forget about Black founders, Indigenous founders, Middle Eastern founders, Latinx founders, which are the groups that still don't get a lot of financing, we're going to miss those solutions that are critical for our planet, right? I have this background behind me, not to also just help me keep warm in the wintertime, right? As a reminder where we are. But, you know, when I look at those marginalized communities, island nations, you know, in the Caribbean and place in the South Pacific, they're the ones that are going to be impacted the most by climate change. They're the ones that are going to see the brunt of what happens. And yet, if their voices aren't allowed to be at that table to say, these are the solutions that we are working for because these are the ones our community needs most, then there's a big missing. And the brilliance is out there, right? And the capability of doing these amazing things and amazing technologies, and they just need to unlock that capital, right? You know, you mentioned that venture capital catalyst initiative, that Black tech capital is looking to seek some funding from the government. Yet when I look at a report, say from the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, you know, yes, there's a move towards more diversity, but again, those groups I mentioned, Black, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, they're not at the table, right? With East Asians, South Asians, but we're still not the ones. When I look at work of other venture capital funds like BKR Capital, you know, I give my hats off to Isaac and Lee's. They've really paid for, you know, what it's going to be. And I see my sister there, Melissa Allen, on the call, right, with her fund, Capital M Ventures. Between the three of us funds, and then also a little bit coming with Matter Ventures, that's it in Canada for focusing on Black founders. And we're just a drop in the bucket. BKR is the largest at just under 20 million. You know, when you talk about that cryptocurrency and the pension fund losing $90 million, collectively, we're not even there when we look at the focus on investment into Black capital. So that's the piece that I see, you know, where it needs to be stepped up, where the government comes in, and then so we can do that. And to echo what you know, Jeff is saying, we do the same thing. I start working with Black Tech Capital. We start working with founders in the community, seeing what their needs are, working to make sure that the founders are the right ones, right? Before we make that investment, make sure they're coachable, make sure that they're working on the right thing, and give them the help. We don't want to just be that kind of capital, just here's some dollars, go see what you can do with it. No, we need to be working with them, connecting them in with our networks, and making a difference there. But to, you know, going back to your question, it is lots of exciting opportunities in every single space and amazing things that I see Black founders doing and accomplishing out there.